order. Jack Rankin to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House considers the impact of environmental, social and governance requirements on the defence industry. And I'd like at this time to thank the Minister and honourable members for making time to attend what I hope will be a consequential debate. Last week, we all heard from the Canadian Prime Minister speaking at Davos. He is not quite my flavour of politics, but he spoke a truth. We live in a much more dangerous world, and we cannot rely on the international rules-based order to protect us. We are quickly learning an ancient truth, that hard power is the most material reality. If we continue to play by imagined rules, whilst our enemies, and sometimes even our allies, are playing a different game altogether, then we are destined to lose, with disastrous consequences for our country, for our children. And sadly, many of these old assumptions are embedded and entrenched in our financial services industry, in our universities, in our politics, and this in turn is having a deeply damaging effect on British defence companies and ultimately in our ability to defend ourselves.
Will the Honourable Member give way?
Be delighted to.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Defence firms like Leonardo and Yeovil are happy to invest in environmental and social products. Leonardo invests heavily in Yeovil College, entertainment venues, and is building its own silent farm. Does the Honourable Member agree, however, that if defence firms are to meet these obligations, the government does need to award contracts like the new medium-lift helicopter, or we will lose these benefits for our community forever?
Well, he makes a powerful point about Leonardo, which I know build helicopters in his constituency, and I'm sure the Minister has heard his pointed remarks here today. Parties of both colours have pledged to increase defence spending. This Labour government have committed to an uplift to 3% in the next Parliament. But when will we see it? What proportion of this will simply make up historic military pensions? How much is actually going to cutting-edge R&D? Currently, only 4% of defence spending goes to SMEs, which often lead the way on innovation. But what if I told the Minister that there are billions of pounds in funding waiting to be unlocked that would cost the taxpayer nothing, be a huge boost to the economy and improve our national security? It's sitting in the private sector. The importance of private investment was recognised in the Strategic Defence Review, but we aren't properly utilising it because right now, British defence companies are deprived of lots of that potential investment because funds of various descriptions prioritise sustainable investment or environmental social governance, ESG, regardless of return, and sometimes actively rule out defence explicitly or implicitly in the rules they set. Delighted.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for giving way and for securing this important debate. I just wanted to take an opportunity to correct what I'm hoping was a slip of tongue when he said of both colours when he means of all colours, because I believe the Liberal Democrats have come forward with a proposal for £20 billion worth of defence bonds in order to properly finance the rapid scale-up in defence manufacturing that we need in this UK.
Well, I'd be delighted to correct the record, Madam Chairman. It's good to see that parties of all colours are backing increased defence spending in a more uncertain world. The system, the ESG system, I'm afraid, implies, in some sense, that defence investment is unethical. But, Madam Chairman, there is nothing less ethical than sending British sons and daughters into battle under-equipped. And that is not a party political point of blue, red or yellow. Indeed, I am proud to represent the parts of Slough Borough not covered by the Honourable Member for Slough, the Chairman of Defence Select Committee, and we've discussed this very point, on which he and members of his committee all agree, I understand. Indeed, many on that side of the House also see the problems of ESG for what it is. In March last year, a group of 100 Labour members of Parliament wrote to banks and fund managers urging them to prioritise defence investment and to class British defence investment as ethical. I welcome that the Honourable Member for York Outer is here today. I know he has discussed this matter directly, but also with the FCA, and I look forward to his substantive contribution in the debate today. But I would gently point out that some of this ideology is pushed by some of those on the left who might take woolly views on certain conflicts, Gaza specifically. We should do what we can in this place to challenge that culture, and I suspect there are many of these naive rules made in this place, perhaps in different geopolitical circumstances, which we should reassess. To fix this, we must at first acknowledge just how bad things are in some instances. I'm a member of the Scots Affairs Select Committee, and a few weeks ago we were able to question Warwick Malcolm of ADS Scotland, which represent defence businesses in Scotland, about the real chilling effects that progressive authoritarianism has had on the businesses they represent. When he attempted to host a Scottish parliamentary reception to highlight STEM apprenticeships, broader than just defence, 200 protesters shut down the Parliament, allowing no one in or out, and essentially cancelled the whole event. Those who did squeeze through, and many of these were people in their young 20s, apprentices, through the melee outside, they came in tears because of the abuse they faced. Sadly, only the Scottish Conservatives supported this reception, whilst all others steered clear. What message does this send to those in the industry, those hard-working constituents of MSPs, when their representatives have no time for them and effectively shun them? Mr Malcolm also talked to the committee about how a company he represented was vandalised, which reduced its capacity to 75%. How will that business remain viable? When we think about careers fairs at universities being shut down and damaging the attractiveness of that as a sector to work in, this is a sector that keeps us safe, and yet it's not one that employees often feel safe to work in. I will be delighted to.
I thank the honourable member for humouring me with a second opportunity to intervene. And he raises what I believe to be an incredibly important point, which is that so many defence manufacturers, especially in the southwest, provide high-skilled job opportunities for local people. My honourable friend has already mentioned Leonardo in Yeovil, which employs vast numbers of people in my constituency of West Dorset. And actually those links with local schools and local higher education institutions are vital for a pathway for people in Southwest, especially rural communities, that might not necessarily have another avenue into high-skilled labour.
Well, of course he's right, and I thank him again for his intervention. And I think we collectively have a responsibility to advocate for these businesses, as the honourable member just did, but we also need to face down, I think, this quite pernicious culture as a nation. To return directly to the point of financial institutions, I think the culture we set in here does influence them. And I think we don't have to look too far away from ourselves to see where the problem is. Our own parliamentary pension fund de facto excludes British defence companies by investing in sustainable funds. Its single largest equity holding, the BlackRock Low Carbon Fund, fully excludes nuclear weapons, which has the reality of excluding almost all of defence. And what does our pension fund invest in instead? Tencent Holdings, the parent company of WeChat, largely considered to be part of China's surveillance state. This is the very nub of the issue and illuminates the great irony of the situation. The FCA will unequivocally say that there is no conflict between ESG and defence, which sometimes might be technically true, but often the reality paints a different picture. We just need to follow the money. The Devon County Council Pension Fund, which I picked because I thought Mr Pollard might be responding to the debate and covers his constituency, states clearly that it prioritises return on investment and does not impose ethical exclusions. But if one follows its investment down the rabbit hole to its pooled provider, Brunel, which handles 93% of the council's pension funds, we find Paris-aligned pooled funds with carbon thresholds and controversial weapons screens. That is how we see the system is set up against the defence industry, and in that system, smaller companies simply have no chance because the filtering happens long before capital ever reaches them. It may well be that pensioners also end up shortchanged, seeing as major British defence industries of BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce and Babcock have each made returns of 50%, 100% and 146% respectively this last year. Even in our most sensitive areas, I hope we never need it, but most sensible people, I think, in this country support the backstop of our nuclear deterrent. Well, ESG potentially threatens that. We currently have retained EU law that adopts the Paris-aligned benchmarks, which excludes nuclear as controversial weapon. For a fund to be considered Paris-aligned, they will have to meet this benchmark, and by retaining this law, we are encouraging this. Whilst the government normally prioritises Trident, there are around 1,500 businesses in the supply chain that are therefore implicated and will therefore be excluded from finance potentially as a result. Whilst we continue to tolerate this madness, We are fighting with one hand behind our back. We've discussed access to capital, but this is useless for SMEs without a bank account. We have defence companies in this country being debanked. I first came across this issue when meeting a defence SME in my constituency who had been debanked by high street banks 3 times. That business makes ammunition for Ukraine. Think of the message that sends to a defence startup. An entrepreneur just wouldn't go near it. Some of this is being driven by the B Corp certification, and I urge the Minister to look at this. Know your customer and anti-money laundering operations checks are also a huge issue which needs to be addressed. It's all downstream of the same negative approach to defence I've described. In conclusion, Madam Chairman, this culture has, at least in part, been brought about by successive government policy. So too, it can be reversed by it. As a start, the government should insist that all publicly managed funds shouldn't be invested in funds which explicitly exclude defence. That would be a clear statement of intent about the government's expectation and encourage others to do the same. And we should have clearer rules about exclusion of nuclear so that those SMEs vital to Trident deterrent are not unfairly cut out. As much as it pains me to say, perhaps we could even learn from France, who treat the defence sector as strategically vital. The Chancellor could write to the FCA today and change its remit. Just imagine the change if we were to approach defence as we've approached climate policy over the past 20 years. I'm aware the government passed legislation in October permitting the FCA to regulate the ESG sector in 2028, and whilst this might seem like a positive step, it could possibly simply entrench the concept legally and say that ESG is somewhat sanctioned by the government. If we are serious about rebuilding our defence infrastructure, and if we're serious about national security, then we must get serious about the self-harm that a culture of ESG has done and is doing, and we have to be prepared to take steps to reverse it. Thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. We'll also be going to the front bench at about 3:30, and I'm aware we're expecting a vote, and that might come as early as 3:30, so obviously I'll suspend sitting when that happens. Luke Charters.
Thank you, Ms. McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And can I genuinely thank the Honourable Member for Windsor for raising this debate and for his kind words. I think this is something we can work on cross-party to actually change the culture across financial services with our voices from this place. And may I also say what a pleasure it is to be here with my honourable friend, the Minister. And I want to just, if I may, take this opportunity to thank her for her work on things like Op Courage and Op Ascend and all the work she's doing on veterans' homelessness. Look, if I may, I want to be very clear that ESG does not need to get in the way of lending to SMEs. And I think it's important to set out from the outset that many conflate ESG rules with broader ethical and broader commercial decisions that firms make. And I'll perhaps come back onto that. Because I speak from some experience professionally. I was acting head of compliance for a fintech where day in, day out, I was making some of these calls about whether to do business with some of these customers. So I think what I really want to argue is that ESG can, in limited circumstances, though, be interpreted to be blocking lending to SME. And I think that is increasingly inconsistent and increasingly at odds with our national security, industrial strategy and our economic resilience. I want to touch on what I believe is an artificial distinction between so-called dual-use military technology and single-use military equipment. And I come across so many lenders, the main high street lenders, that find this really difficult. British high street lenders, they've got every right to put their hands up and say, we don't want to lend to any company that's involved in chemical weapons or weaponry such as cluster munitions. They've got every right to look at some of the UN weapons conventions and say, we do not want anything to do with them. But so many lenders are not lending to dual-use military equipment and dual-use purposes. I want to give some examples of that. I met a fantastic company at DSCI called Needles and Pins Aerospace, and they found it very difficult in terms of banking, insurance and finance. They produce the insulation that goes on military helicopters. military helicopters, by the way, that are engaged in humanitarian aid missions around the world. And the insulation that goes in these helicopters, that's not an ordnance or a bomb. It's to protect our British Armed Forces. And I think it's really worth bearing in mind that these lenders and their compliance departments, given that I was from that parish before, they should really get to know the products and the services that their customers want to seek finance for. Another example is in my constituency, Edmund Optics, and they produce prisms and lenses, and of course there are medical applications for that, there are aerospace, commercial satellite and civilian aircraft applications to that. But some of these products and services have a dual use. There is also a military use to them. And again, lenders get so caught up in a very binary distinction. What they must spend more time on is understanding the products and services that they have. I want to give another shout out to 4GD, and this is a data-driven training defence SME. I've worked extensively with ADS, the industry trade body, and their founder Rob, who I actually saw yesterday, has told me countless stories about being debanked. Look, his business is about training British Armed Forces to do better at what they do, so they are more equipped against our adversaries, they're safer and they're more resilient. There's nothing more ethical than that. And the fact that high street lenders have turned their doors on that commercial opportunity shows that there is really an inherent laziness of some in compliance departments who refuse to understand the products and services that their prospective customers are actually seeking to seek finance for. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Windsor for referencing the work that I've done alongside the Member for Aldershot, where collectively, along with 100 Labour parliamentarians last year, we wrote to fund managers and bank managers about ESG. And what I was really pleased to see that came off the back of that was two things. One, there were some examples of even funds that were marketed as sustainable funds that actually said, do you know what, we are going to invest in defence companies. Because again, they found that if you look at all of the regulatory rules, there's nothing that inherently disbars sustainable funds from investing in defence. There's nothing within the regulator's rule book that does that. That is just a fact. And a fact that was ultimately confirmed by my old employer, the Financial Conduct Authority, and I'm immensely grateful to the Chief Exec, Nick Hill, for his speech last year on this and the statement on this. I think the FCA has been absolutely rock-solid clear that there is no tension between ESG regulatory rules and defence financing. There's no tension whatsoever. And so I would say to financial services practitioners out there listening in today, please take heed of that. And there has been some good shifts, as I mentioned. But ESG and broader ethical considerations are only one part of structural barriers facing defence firms. And recent work by my colleagues across the House, including a report I co-authored, Rewiring British Defence Financing, makes this point clearly. It shows that ESG considerations actually sit alongside and are actually outweighed by deeper, more persistent problems across access to capital, commercial lending risk, cash flow pressures, contracting structures and compliance complexity. Defence SMEs are not failing to secure finance because they're somehow irresponsible actors, but because they operate in an ecosystem defined by long payment cycles, sometimes single dominant customers like the primes, uncertain procurement pipelines, and fragmented support across government. And on that last point, I want to turn to the work that my honourable friend, the Minister for Defence, Resilience and Industry, who couldn't be here, and he's done some phenomenal work actually setting up the Office for Small Business Growth within the Ministry of Defence. And that is designed to break down some of the contractual complexities and fear factor that many defence SMEs face when they're trying to contract into the MOD. And I'm very grateful to confirm to the House that one company in my constituency in York Outer, Flyby Technologies, is actually going to be part of the shaping cohort of the new OSBG to really get into some of these nitty-gritty about how we can streamline the contracting processes for SMEs in line with the government's mission to actually increase the direct spend to defence SMEs across the country. I do want to touch on the role of primes when it comes to SMEs in particular. Sometimes the cash flow challenges that defence primes create, it's not acceptable. And I think the primes that are great employees of this country, I've been up to Barrow-in-Furness, I've seen firsthand how BAE Systems is transforming the fortunes of that town. But where those primes, and they do have a great understanding of the tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers in their supply chain, they really need to make sure that they're paying those SMEs on time and quickly. And this is not just a mundane point. If you sit down and you look at the cash flow with any of the CFOs of some of these SMEs, it's very clear. If you're on a 90-day payment term or 120-day payment terms from a prime, that means it increases your working capital requirement. You've got to go out to lenders and actually try and get financing just to cover that shortfall because the primes are really slow. And that actually means in turn that when defence SMEs are trying to go out there to get loans for their inventory or for asset financing, it means they're often on worse terms. So primes, please, you've got a duty to the wonderful SMEs of Britain to start paying them quickly, because that will actually, it creates this cyclical effect where their payment terms actually improved. And there are some great primes that are actually better about that. But I think overall, the result is a system where actually really highly capable export-ready firms struggle with the basics. They struggle to secure bank accounts, insurance and working capital, not at the margin, but as a matter of course. And particularly on the insurance side, I am worried that some insurers are increasingly hesitant about insuring defence companies because of the risk of political violence. And I've worked with Aviva on this, and others. And it's quite interesting, really, isn't it? Because I noticed that some of the protesters that are targeting these insurers, they may well have an insurance policy from one of those insurers, or they may well have their workplace defined contribution pensions in one of those insurers' accounts. So there's a degree of hypocrisy there. But insurers have every confidence from members of this place that you are doing right by the defence sector to support their growth and development. But why do all of these complexities matter, as the Honourable Member has touched on? It creates serious consequences because where these challenges mount up, it could undermine our sovereign defence capability. If British firms can't raise capital here, well, what do? They may well choose to scale abroad, sell to overseas buyers rather than the British base, or fail over altogether. We can become more dependent on foreign supply chains for critical technologies, and actually my honourable friend, the Minister for Industry, has done some really strong work around critical minerals and our sovereign capability there. We have to ensure that there is a sovereign financial base to support our sovereign defence industry. These challenges that we've talked about in terms of procurement, ESG, access to finance, they actually hit SMEs the hardest. They don't have big teams of financial experts. The larger primes can navigate these more suitably. They have access to wider capital pools, which smaller firms do not. And I think that really there is a really risk of a strategic contradiction, because on the one hand we're asking defence firms to scale, innovate and deliver at pace, but on the one hand we seem to be tolerating a financial system that treats some firms as a reputational liability. And that's not sustainable, to borrow a term. So I think the issue is not necessarily the ESG principles themselves, but rather the absence of clarity in how lenders are applying their risk tolerance to defence. So ESG concerns are only one part of the financing challenge facing defence firms, alongside credit risk, contracting structures and cash flow, but they are just the tip of the iceberg. And because these issues can be often poorly defined, they create uncertainty that deters lending. So what's missing, I think, is a shared understanding across government, regulators, financial institutions that defence, when conducted lawfully, in line with UN weapons conventions, but in support of democratic security. That's not a problem, but it is actually a public good to be enabled. And I think it was a theme that the Honourable Member touched on. There's nothing more ethical than lending to defence companies that are equipping our Ukrainian friends. And our other countries around the world understand this. The US has been much more explicit in aligning its financial system with its national security priorities, particularly in terms of single-use and lethal military equipment. So what needs to change? I think there is an overwhelming case for a multilateral defence bank, such as the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, that would meet some of these financing challenges. We cannot just look at incremental fixes, and I don't want to take up too much time touching on that, but there is a role for multilateral development finance. As the report I wrote sets out, private capital alone is not just filling the gap, particularly for SMEs in the dual-use space, but where finance does flow, it can be short-term. We really need to make sure that the institutions of the state, be that the NSIF, which is an arm's-length body as part of the British Business Bank, be that the National Wealth Fund, be that the UKDI, I don't want to get into the details, but they need to sing together to make sure that their finance is coming in to innovative technologies. We need to learn the lessons from DARPA in the US, and I heard a fact that a significant proportion of US GDP growth comes from the DARPA investments of the 1980s, of course, that invented the internet and the smartphone and so many of the underlying technologies. So let's learn a bit of the leadership role of DARPA.
I'm grateful. He plainly knows a great deal about this subject and I think is really educating a few of us on it. He talks about the US example, and I wonder if he could also reflect on the regulatory regime in the European Union around ESG, given that the EU is about to start investing considerably more in defence.
So I think when it comes to our European friends, we have to have cross-border financing, and I've met some of the commercial lenders in some of the main German lenders that want to come in, and likewise there are British financial services that are investing in some of the success stories like Rheinmetall and some of the great European defence primes. But I think we've got to come together, not just with our European friends, but with Canada and other allied nations around the world to approach defence financing on a multilateral basis. That's the real lesson, I think. And let me just touch on what our adversaries are doing, if I may, Ms McVeigh, very briefly, because our adversaries know that they need to innovate quickly when it comes to building up their own financing capabilities. If you look at Russia, they are actually moving to more off-sheet balance sheet lending to a lot of their defence sector. Russian advanced manufacturing companies are increasingly gaining access to the Chinese bond market. We know, in general, the Russian war economy is mobilising at pace, and clearly, when it comes to the financing mechanisms within some of our adversaries, they're daring to do things differently. Of course, according to their rule book and ethics and of their particular countries, we need to be agile enough to reform our own financing capabilities at pace too. Because I'm very concerned that we risk forcing British defence SMEs to seek foreign ownership, offshore their operations, or seek finance overseas simply to survive, and that is strategic self-harm when it comes to our sovereign defence capabilities. To close, you'd be pleased to hear, Ms McVeigh, in an era of renewed geopolitical competition, the question's not whether the state should play a role in defence finance, but whether we are prepared to act now in order to do so with the seriousness that our security environment demands. I believe that having a really strong defence financing sector, that actually acts as a deterrent to some of our adversaries, and it means that where we need to scale industrial capability much quicker, we are ready to do so if we have a defence financing revolution. This is not a choice between values and security. It's actually about recognising that in the world we live in, the two are inseparable. So I hope that the Minister may take this opportunity to set out the government can encourage lenders to turn the taps on to some of these innovative defence SMEs, no matter whether they're producing prisms, no matter whether they're training our special forces, no matter whether they're insulating our helicopters. There is nothing more ethical in our modern world than supporting some of these defence SMEs which are maintaining our collective security.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As always, a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Windsor for setting the theme, and I also congratulate the Honourable Member for York Outer for his excellent contribution as well, one of plenty of knowledge and information. Obviously nice to see the Minister in her place, and I hope and wish her well in the role she plays, and a reminder gently of the invitation to come to Beyond the Battlefield in Portfolio, my constituency. We'll maybe be able to confirm that shortly. I'll leave that with you. It's nothing to do with this debate, by the way, but just from the opportunities here. Okay, thank you. Our armed forces protect our freedoms and deter aggression in a world that has become increasingly volatile. The defence sector employs tens of thousands of people across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, while sustaining thousands more in supply chains and underpins our sovereign capability. In today's climate, where threats have become much more serious and less predictable than any time since the end of the Cold War, the 2025 Strategic Defence Review highlights the importance of private investment, stating that the sector must make a concerted effort to unlock private capital and expertise, and outlines the environmental, the social and the governance ESG role in the sector. I'm minded, Madam Chair, that the pastor of my church, the Baptist Church in Newton Ards, just last year said there's 67 wars in the world, and that reminds us of the it's almost like a world at war in the true sense physically. Members will be aware that from June 2028, ESG ratings providers will be regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, introducing new rules on transparency, on governance, on conflicts of interest and stakeholder engagement. And there's been a significant shift towards identifying these factors since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Always in our mind, and the pictures of Kiev in the paper today, and the stories in the press remind us of the pressure the Ukrainians are under. Morningstar data shows that exposure to aerospace and defence has increased across European funds, including those with ESG labels. This reflects, I believe, a growing recognition that a strong defence industrial base is essential for security, so this government's own industrial strategy defence sector plan must emphasise the importance of making this sector more attractive to private investment. And I have to congratulate the Minister and Government as well, as they continue to support and increase the defence sector. And the money they've allocated for Northern Ireland are very, very welcome, and I appreciate that. I'll highlight two important examples from a Northern Ireland perspective that illustrate, I believe, both the challenges and the opportunities. Thales UK, located in East Belfast, is a key player when it comes to defence innovation. I've visited Thales on several occasions with my colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Belfast East. I want to remind the House of the £1.6 billion deal announced in March 24 for 5,000 lightweight air defence missiles. One of the reasons why Ukraine has been so successful in holding their own is because of these weapons. This is currently supporting approximately 700 jobs at Thales, whilst also supporting Ukraine's defence efforts in the current conflict through the production of the missiles. The work done at Thales highlights Northern Ireland's key position, I believe, and contribution within the UK defence industry. If I can gently say to the Minister, I said it to the other Minister in the Chamber, that I'm very keen to ensure that Northern Ireland's defence sector can see more of the contracts and more of the opportunities coming through. And I know government wants to do that, by the way. I'm not saying they're not doing that, but just to emphasise that again, if you don't mind. Thales has been proactive in engaging with ESG principles by contributing to the drafting of the UK Defence ESG Charter in 24 through the ADS Group, integrating ESG criteria into supplier selection and supporting the UK's low carbon transition through energy efficient technologies and through cyber resilience. So far from being restricted by ESG, Thales continues to demonstrate that responsible, ethical practices do strengthen capacity to compete while attracting local talent building investor confidence in a sector that is vital to our national security. The other thing I'm always very encouraged, Madam Deputy Chair, by Talis is the work and the introduction of apprentices. They're committed to that there. They've done it this year, and they help the students pay their some of their fees as well, which means that, and they get a good wage. So it really is constructive, positive, and that comes through the business that government does here with them and what they do as a company. I'm also proud to raise another example of Northern Ireland's contribution to our defence industry, the historic Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, one of only 3 naval shipyards in the UK equipped to carry out major MOD work. We're very pleased to see that central to government's policy once again. In 2023, Harland and Wolff became part of the Team Resolute consortium with Navantia UK and BNT. After being awarded a £1.6 billion contract by the MOD to build 3 fleet support ships for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The impact on the shipyard will be significant. Upgrades such as new automated panel lines, advanced robotics, technology moving forward, and very clearly meeting the ESG criteria as they wanted to do that as well. Harland and Wolff are committed to long-term ethical production sustainability whilst providing jobs in Northern Ireland. Really proactive in meeting all these things. I think if you ever want to move forward with a policy, you've got to bring the companies with you, and quite clearly in Northern Ireland that's happening. And to be fair, I think it's happening across the whole of the United Kingdom. So I urge the Minister to commit to issuing joint guidance with the Treasury and the FCA to financial institutions, clarifying that responsible investment in UK defence companies, vital for national security and jobs in places like Belfast, can be fully compatible with ESG principles. Madam Chair, I conclude with this comment. I welcome very much that government is prioritising private investment in defence, but we must build on that by providing clearer policy guidance. So it is in our United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland national interest to ensure that our defence industry continues to be supported by Belfast-based firms like Talis and Harland and Wolff. And I urge the Minister to identify and support measures that unlock investment, increase the contractual opportunities for business in Northern Ireland in particular, and at the same time maintaining our defence sovereignty. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms McVeigh, and I thank the Honourable Member for Windsor for securing this important debate and introducing it so eloquently. And it's also an honour to follow the Honourable Member for Strangford, who always makes an important contribution to debates about defence matters, and the Honourable Member for York Outer, whose knowledge of this particular area about defence financing is extremely granular. Today's debate is a chance to make clear that the highest form of corporate social responsibility is for a company to be involved in the defence of the country. To me, it's quite bizarre that people and institutions would put the provision of proper equipment for our armed forces or our allies who are fighting against fascism in the Ukraine in the same category for divestment as tobacco or pornography or modern slavery or forced labour. That just seems perverse to me. Investment in the task of keeping the British people safe from the growing threat posed by hostile actors isn't just legitimate, it's a moral necessity. In the context of the Strategic Defence Review, which correctly identifies the urgency and significance of unlocking private capital to drive the investment in defence we need to see the growing and complex threats facing the country, the impact of environmental, social and governance, or ESG ratings on securing finance for defence must be looked at more closely than ever before. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that the whole point of having the strongest possible defence capability is to act as a deterrent. We're not aiming to use these weapons if we possibly can. We're using them to try to stop a war happening. I'm sure I don't need to point out to members the ethical, environmental and social harm of conflict, but I know that members across the House will be acutely aware that the best way to avoid war is to prepare for one. Only by projecting strength and showing our enemies that we are ready to fight can we deter the worst-case outcome. Back in March 2025, as the Honourable Member for York Outer has referred to, it was the Honourable Member for Windsor, along with 100 other Labour MPs, I think it was the Honourable Member for York Outer that coordinated the letter, signed a letter. It was co-coordinated by my honourable friend, the Member for Aldershot, who I know is disappointed not to be able to join us here today. And it called on Britain's bank and fund managers to do away with rules that classed investment in defence, notably in supporting Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression, as somehow unethical. As this letter stated, there can be no more ethical investment than giving the Ukrainian people every ounce of support that can be mustered by their allies. That same standard, of course, applies to our own defence, one of the core tasks our constituents send us to this place to take care of. 10 months on from that letter, I know today is a prime opportunity for the Minister to update us on what considerations the Government has given to this issue, especially with regard to what I hope is the imminent Defence Investment Plan. As a Member of Parliament for a constituency in the North East of England, I am particularly excited by the opportunities that the Government's increase in defence spending can create for my constituents in North Durham and across the region. We know that less than a third of the MOD's spending with British industry is directed to London and the South East, so defence can be an engine for growth in the regions. I share the Labour Government's ambition for defence spending to act as a key engine for economic growth, especially in more deprived post-industrial parts of the country that have borne the brunt of decades of deindustrialisation, including my own North Durham constituency. And it's worth noting, there were tens of thousands of jobs in the defence sector during the Cold War in the northeast of England. There were shipyards, swan hunters, there was a very large factory, Vickers, producing land systems, which is still a very good factory, but is under Pearson Engineering, but is a lot smaller. And people have that memory of the contribution industrially the northeast was making to defence. Still, at the moment, unfortunately, the North East has the lowest per capita defence spend of any region or nation. That's on the MOD's own figures. I would go so far as to argue that there are significant ethical and social benefits from the kind of defence investment that would bring jobs to our area, upskilling my constituents and providing the opportunity to make a good living in the patriotic duty of pitching in to equipping the people that are defending our country. So could the Minister update us on the particular impact of ESG ratings on directing capital towards areas like the North East, where there's a heritage of industrial jobs and skills, and where investment would bolster the Government's agenda of tackling regional inequality and bringing opportunity back to places like County Durham? Just because, when wrong, ESG ratings can act as a drag on crucial investment in defence, we should not write off the importance of ethical considerations when financing the defence of our nation. It is right that even when investing in defence capabilities, we do all we can to operate in line, for instance, with the planet's environmental limits. Indeed, many defence companies have already changed in line with ESG considerations. Through the UK Defence ESG Charter, the defence sector in the UK has collaborated to drive ambition and action on sustainability. The Charter promotes greater transparency, dedicating firms to working together to meet commitments focused on climate transition, clean technology, societal impact, and governance and ethics. The Charter was shortlisted for the 2025 Trade Association Forum Awards in the ESG Initiative of the Year category. To give one example, and it's actually the company that the Honourable Member for Strangford talked so eloquently about because it's got a site so near to his constituency, Thales in the UK source all of their electricity from renewables, and ESG forms at least 15% of their supplier selection criteria. The Platinum medal from EcoVadis places Thales amongst the top 1% of all firms in its rankings. Clearly, the moral grandstanding of backing away from defence investment on ethical grounds does nothing to actually improve the ethical footprint of the defence industry, and instead, we ought to be working with industry to incentivise better practices, such as the ones that I've just outlined. With that in mind, I was hoping the Minister would be able to elaborate further the positive role on ESG that defence companies can play, and how can we ensure that the industry takes the most possible consideration of its impact on the planet without getting in the way of their #1 priority of defending our nation. Thankfully, ESG standards are becoming less and less of a roadblock to defence spending, with ESG labelled investment in defence rising steadily since 2021. However, broader structural issues continue to act as a barrier to unlocking growth in defence. SMEs, as the Honourable Member for York Outer has mentioned, face particular challenges accessing finance and banking due to banks' own compliance policies rather than ESG ratings. I would appreciate if the Minister can expand on how the Government can address these challenges and encourage banks to adjust their own compliance policies to better ensure that defence SMEs can access the capital they need to get off the ground. We must never lose sight of the moral case for the defence of our nation. That is something that I know matters so much to my constituents in North Durham, many of whose family members are veterans or serving in the armed forces, one in 10 of the households in my constituency. We must do all we can to secure the capital our defence industry needs to rearm the country at pace and stand up to the growing threats we face. I look forward to hearing from the Minister about how we can ensure that ESG requirements don't act as a barrier to this moral and practical necessity, and I hope to continue working with members across the House to drive investment in the British defence industry, especially in the North East of England.
Katie Lamb.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It is a pleasure to serve with you and the Chair this afternoon, and thank you to my honourable friend, the Member for Windsor, for securing this important debate. It is often said, including by my honourable friend in opening, that we are now living in an ever more dangerous world, the most dangerous world in the lifetimes of me and my honourable friend, though he never tires of reminding me that he is a year younger than I. The Government's own 2025 Strategic Defence Review stated that the threats we face are now more serious and less predictable than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Clearly, then, we should be doing everything in our power to make sure that our armed forces are well staffed and well equipped. The defence of the realm is the first duty of any government. But for this to mean anything, defending our nation must take priority over other aims. Yet far too often, we have seen our armed forces and the companies which supply them forced to put social value requirements ahead of their existential need to keep us safe. Crazy as it sounds, this is no exaggeration or hypothetical concern. In 2022, the Royal Air Force paused recruitment from white men in order to raise the proportion of women and ethnic minorities in the Air Force. They quite literally and explicitly would rather have hired nobody to defend this country from the air than hired a white guy. This is lunacy. Cruel or unpleasant behaviour towards women is repulsive and clearly should have no place in our armed forces, their suppliers, or indeed any workforce. When women want to, and can do, for many roles in the armed forces have physical requirements that cannot be compromised, jobs that have historically been filled by men, there should be no barrier to them doing so, and I applaud them, as I applaud the men who are willing to risk their lives for our freedom. But to abandon our defence of the skies in the name of diversity quotas is completely and utterly mad. The RAF has since apologised for its decision, but I speak about this today because it is crucial for the context of the debate. This is the climate in which the British countries who wish to supply equipment to our military must operate. In order to trade in the UK, as has been covered by many honourable members this afternoon, defence companies must comply with the general ESG regulations set out under the Companies Act 2006. If they wish to sell their equipment to the British government, then they must comply with the rules set out under the Ministry of Defence's Climate Change and Sustainability Strategic Approach. This includes the publication of a carbon reduction plan and compliance with rules designed to minimise environmental impact. And if these firms wish to be publicly listed, they must wrangle with the Financial Conduct Authority's rules on ESG ratings. Generally, defence companies are not considered to be an ethical investment, meaning that they are often scored badly for the purposes of ESG ratings, as my honourable friend and several honourable members have mentioned. Given that the FCA has consistently pushed funds to focus on ESG-compliant investments, this is clearly a significant cause for concern. Just last year, some of the country's largest investors, including the National Employment Savings Trust, the workplace pension scheme set up by the government, reiterated their determination to refuse to invest in defence stocks in the name of ethics. What exactly is ethical about shunning those companies that dedicate themselves to equipping our defence and protecting our freedom? And as the FCA moves to standardise rules for ESG ratings providers, we still have no clear indication about how the regulator intends to treat defence companies for the purpose of ESG ratings. In pursuit of secondary aims, we are making life more difficult for British defence companies and, in turn, for the armed forces that we expect to keep us safe. One way or another, our armed forces will need to procure the equipment that they need to do their jobs. While ESG requirements continue to stifle the British defence industry, we are forced into choosing one of two options, neither of them good. We could pay over the odds for equipment produced in this country. The compliance costs created by ESG rules and the disincentives to private investment created by the ESG ratings regime may force many defence firms to put up their prices, meaning higher costs for the British taxpayer should we wish to rely on military equipment produced here. This also makes our kit more expensive and less desirable for our allies to buy, and fewer customers drives up prices even further. Or we must rely on equipment from overseas, leaving us reliant on other countries. Neither of those outcomes is acceptable. The status quo is bad for our armed forces and bad for the British taxpayer. The answer, of course, is to reject this dichotomy entirely. We should unleash the natural strengths of the British defence industry, including by scrapping those ESG requirements which make life more difficult for British defence firms. It would be remiss of me not to mention that, as heavy manufacturing firms, British defence companies are also likely to be disproportionately damaged by energy policy which this government is pursuing, which has produced the highest industrial energy prices in the developed world. We know that our defence industry has the capability to be one of the best, if not the best, in the world. As recently as 2013, this country's defence industry was second in the world for the export of military equipment when measured by total value of new orders. Today, partly thanks to the growth of the regulatory burden on defence firms, we've fallen to seventh. This is bad for our own military, which must now choose between importing its equipment from abroad or paying over the odds for equipment produced in this country. And it is bad for our interests overseas. After all, militaries around the world will always need new equipment. I would much rather that they were able to buy British than from competitors in Russia or in China. It is clearly true that the problems which the British defence industry now faces did not begin under this government or even under the previous government. But it does, of course, now fall to this government to address them. So I hope the Minister will be able to tell us whether the government has any plans either to exempt defence firms from existing ESG regulations or to make any changes to these regulations for all companies. I hope that she will also be able to offer us some insight on whether the government has engaged with the FCA about the classification of defence firms for ESG purposes ahead of the consultation deadline on the 31st of March.
Now come to the front bench, the Lib Dem spokesperson, Helen Maguire.
Thank you, and it's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms McVeigh. And I thank the Honourable Member for Windsor for securing this important debate. Private investment is the lifeblood of our defence industry, now more than ever. And in an era that's defined by geopolitical volatility, from Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine to the unpredictable actions of global leaders, defence preparedness must be at the heart of this government's agenda. The landscape is shifting. World leaders are recalibrating their strategies, and the private sector is doing the same. ESG-focused funds are increasingly recognising the strategic and ethical imperative of investing in defence. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, exposure of ESG European equity funds to aerospace and defence has surged by a factor of 2.7. This is not an anomaly, it is a trend. I recognise there is often confusion from some stakeholders who claim that ESG rules exclude defence companies from sustainable finance, but ESG disclosure and labelling rules do not require defence exclusion. Let me be clear. ESG rules do not exclude defence companies. The confusion is misplaced. Many sustainable funds invest in defence, and those that exclude it typically do it for voluntary ethical reasons or reputational concerns, not because ESG rules mandate it. I'm pleased that this government has been clear that they agree there is nothing contradictory between ESG considerations and defence. This position is shared by the Liberal Democrats, who see the much bigger issue as the industry's broader structural problems, such as political uncertainty over defence procurement, long production cycles, export controls and delay in government payments. Having met with many defence companies, including SMEs, I've heard how they are lacking long-term certainty, making it difficult to invest in capacity, innovation and workforce development. Take Labour's recent indecision on the new medium helicopter contract, as my honourable friend recently alluded to, delays risk jobs and investment. Meanwhile, the Defence Investment Plan remains unseen. So could the Minister today confirm when this plan will be published? Defence companies, especially SMEs, need certainty. They need to invest in capacity, innovation and their workforce. The war in Ukraine has shown what is possible when industry and government work together at pace. Yet our current system is failing them. So will the Minister commit to replacing rigid defence reviews with a flexible continuous assessment of security threats? As part of this, the Government must look to improve collaboration with European and NATO partners to develop new technologies, equipment and training, including via the Northern Group. Will the Minister therefore give an update on the UK's access to the SAFE Fund? Prioritising interoperability with NATO allies and other strategic partners means we can support each other during peace and war, and in times like these, that is paramount. SMEs are the backbone of our defence industry. They are central to the UK defence industry, providing flexibility, innovation and supporting high-quality jobs across the UK. However, they face unique challenges that limit their potential to contribute fully to defence capability and UK prosperity. They receive just 5% of the procurement budget, with 42% of contracts going to the same 10 suppliers. This is not just unfair, it's short-sighted. So can the Minister update us on the Defence Office for Small Business Growth? We know the previous Conservative government bungled defence procurement in our country, overseeing budget overruns and insufficient equipment supplies. It's time for a concerted effort to get behind the defence industry. This means no more delays to vital contracts alongside timely and relevant investment plans. This is why the Liberal Democrats will partner with industry to provide the confidence to boost private sector investment in R&D training and facilities, securing key skills and employment opportunities and ensuring that the economic benefits build the prosperity of UK regions. To incentivise defence spending, we have also shared our plans for war bonds. Here, members of the public could loan the government money in the form of a bond which would run over a 2 to 3 year period and pay out the same interest as standard government bonds. The bonds, which could raise up to £20 billion for the military, would give the public a chance to support patriotically our defence. So has the Minister reviewed these proposals, and will she set up a meeting to discuss this in more detail? The world is changing rapidly. We can no longer rely on old certainties, and thanks to Donald Trump, we can no longer depend on our closest allies. The UK's defence industry must come first. So, Minister, will you stand with the defence businesses of all sizes and private investors? Will you commit to making the UK a global leader in defence innovation and resilience? Thank you.
David Reid.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to chair under your chairship today. Now, we all know the world is becoming more dangerous. We talk about it all the time. We have these conversations here in Parliament. We have them at home with constituents, with family and with friends. But we all know that words and conversations alone will not protect us. We need to make the hard choices now to ensure that the state fulfils its most fundamental role, which is protecting its citizens and its borders. Failing to do so puts the rest of our country at risk. Our NHS, our education system, our markets, our way of life. That's why today's debate is so important, and I am genuinely thankful to my honourable friend from Windsor for bringing it forward, because it goes to the heart of a culture that must change rapidly if we are to stay safe. We must ensure that those countries which pose a threat to our democratic way of life are not inadvertently enabled by structures we have imposed upon ourselves. And we've had a number of fantastic contributions from across this chamber today, starting with my friend from Windsor. He set the tone for this whole debate. The world is becoming more dangerous, and the systems that we've lived under, of international law, and the processes that underpin that, is disappearing rapidly, and we need to change to keep pace. He talked about challenging the culture and the need to really push that cultural change from within this chamber so that money is actually flowing into the defence industry. And he touched on a number of points around how ESG is being used in different ways, from campuses on universities to pushing back defence industries from job fairs. And I think we can all agree that that needs to change. The Honourable Member for York Outer, someone who has deep knowledge in this. He's worked in the industry beforehand. He's worked at the coalface to understand how these contracts are formulated across government and industry. And he talked about a point which I'll come on to later, about the distinction between funding for things that go bang, those sort of hard single-effect capabilities, and dual-use technologies. And I just want to thank him and the honourable member for Aldershot for all the work they did to come up with the report on rewiring defence financing. I look forward to hearing the Minister's responses to see how that's impacting work that's going on in the Defence Investment Plan. The honourable member for Strangford, someone who adds almost on a daily basis to defence discussions in this House, talked again about Northern Ireland, about companies such as Thales and Harden and Wolff at the heart of shipbuilding and aerospace defence, and talked about some of those issues and how ESG is being used by those companies to ensure that they stay on government frameworks. And I'd love to speak to him afterwards to understand how some of those policies are potentially impacting their business outputs. The member for North Durham, he talked really powerfully about the issue around deterrence and making sure that we need to invest into defence now to keep us all safe. I think we can all collectively agree that no one wants to go back to war, and there's a number of veterans in here today that have experienced that, that know that we do not want this for our country. But that comes with allocating capital and making sure that we are in a strong position going forward. My honourable friend, the member for the Weald of Kent, talked about ESG in a sort of specific way, talking about how it was used in the Royal Air Force to socially engineer certain outcomes. And I think, again, I know that the RAF has now apologised for that. It should always be a meritocracy. It should be the best person, the best man or woman for that job, and nothing else should get in the way. And she went into some of the nuances as well around the national legislation and the Financial Conduct Authority and some of the red tape that's wrapped around companies. And then lastly, to the Lib Dem spokesperson, completely agree with the points that she raised about the need for government to give firm contractual push over to defence companies so that they know what's coming down the track. I would like to hear more about this bond idea. It was raised in the Chamber 2 nights ago, I think, at the second reading of the Armed Forces Bill. And when we asked questions around where that money would come from, what budgets would need to be cut in order to repay it, if we're talking about 2 to 3 year bonds, I didn't have clear answers. So I'd like to hear more about it. Madam Chair, organisations that have a role to play in our collective national defence must recognise that investing in defence is both patriotic and necessary. Anything that prevents them from doing so should be stripped away. And I truly believe that this cultural shift must begin in earnest in this place. Now, ESG and its 3 pillars examine how a company treats the environment, manages relationship with stakeholders and governs itself. And at first glance, that all makes sense. It's easy to see why those pillars send a signal to the markets about an organisation's priorities. But here's the problem. The framework has evolved in a way that increasingly treats national defence as a negative, signalling that somehow that you're a bad actor. Defence-focused investments have been lumped together with industries such as tobacco and gambling, and the member for North Durham added industries such as pornography. How are we in this position? How did we reach a position that we've forgotten that spending on defence and providing deterrence is the foundation upon which everything else we value in society rests? Now, I often speak to my dad about this. He was born in 1942 in Plymouth during the Blitz, a city that was bombed heavily. Some of my dad's earliest memories were being under the stairs, listening to the drone of the Luftwaffe bombs overhead. His generation were the last in this country to experience borders and national security as something fragile and uncertain. And then you fast forward a few generations, this was raised a few times today, and when you speak to young people today, the idea that they might need to fight for what they love is an abstract concept at best. We've lost our emotive memory of war, and that puts us in a precarious position. I also fear that we're drawing the wrong lessons from history. When we mobilised during the First and Second World Wars, we did so with an existing industrial base. Factories could be repurposed quickly, and critical resources were within reach. Closer to home, the lessons from COVID have further muddied the water. The risk of a debilitating pandemic was high on the national risk register, yet it was not given the seriousness it deserved. What followed was denial, then urgencies, and then companies like Dyson switched production to ventilators, and we had to scramble internationally to source protective equipment for our NHS. In great British fashion, we muddled through. But with the risk of international conflict rising by the day, I do not want us to have to muddle through. We all have a responsibility to ensure that the state fulfils its primary duty, keeping our countrymen and women safe. Everything else is secondary. And I do not want to have to wait until we're punched in the face until we react. That's why this debate matters, and it's about practical steps, where the money for increased defence spending comes from, and how we cut the red tape that's holding back our defence industry. We also need to look hard at how we better align the capital allocation industry with defence. Now, we all know that the Chief of Defence Staff came up with a warning of the 28 billion gap between our current resources and defence ambitions, and we must get serious. And concerns have been raised that only a small fraction of recent defence contracts have gone towards weapons and armour, which again are fuelling fear within the defence industry of an effective procurement freeze at precisely the moment we should be accelerating rearmament. Now, the private sector and private capital are not a silver bullet, but they are a major part of the answer. And I know that the government is reported to be exploring public-private partnerships, but these will not progress while markets continue to view defence as unethical or constrained by ESG stipulations. That must change through government contracts removing such prohibitive clauses and through government being seen as a reliable partner where returns can be guaranteed. That means defence spending that matches the rhetoric and contracts awarded at the scale required to meet the growing threats. And it's encouraging to see parts of the defence investment space already working to shift this culture. The UK Private Capital Trade Association has already had a defence working group up for nearly a year now to defence the capital allocation industry about what national deterrence really means, both defensive and offensive, a point that the member for York Outer raised, and why investment must include hard capabilities that keep us safe, not just dual-use technologies at the edges. But we must also be honest about the barriers that remain. So societal pressures and perceptions around defence, particularly under the S pillar of ESG, have led to real reticence. Many high street financing providers maintain restrictive policies towards defence firms, often requiring higher levels of due diligence. Increasingly, investment funds are developing ESG policies that exclude defence under blanket terminology around weapons or nuclear, extending deep into the supply chain rather than acting in a targeted way. These unregulated exclusions are inhibiting defence investment at exactly the wrong time. Now, I acknowledge that work is in progress to address this, and industry has developed initiatives such as the UK Defence ESG Charter and the HM Treasury ADS Trade Body Joint Task Force, and that was again referred to by the member for York Outer, for Strangford and for North Durham. But I do believe that more parliamentary support is needed to help investors understand the realities of the sector and encourage responsible investment. The government too must provide clear demand signals to both industry and finance, and then the outcome of Defence Industrial Strategy and the Strategic Defence Review will be crucial in setting the tone to where, what and how the UK intends to spend with the defence sector. Now, I don't want to fall into the trap of opposing the government for opposition's sake, and I want Labour to do well. I want the defence ministers to do well, because if they do well, the UK does well, and we should all be on Team UK. That's why I'm offering the following comments constructively, and I hope the Minister receives them in that spirit. So my party has done some hard work over the last 18 months, and we've set out clear plans to boost defence spending through a sovereign defence fund up to £50 billion, funded by reallocating existing expenditure currently directed towards costly environmental projects. This would enable the procurement of drones and new technologies at a far greater pace and scale, transforming the capability and lethality of the British Armed Forces. And crucially, it would help deliver the industrial capacity we need here at home. Now, to enable that ramp-up in domestic production, the Sovereign Defence Fund would mobilise billions in public and private funding to overhaul the defence industrial base, and the practical steps that we can do by taking stakes in UK defence startups, investing in dual-use companies and building resilient supply chains, reducing reliance on hostile states such as China. Now, this is a fully funded plan based on repurposing existing government expenditure towards this national priority, and it's comprised of three elements. So first, there's £6 billion that will be reallocated from the research and development budget in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology towards the Ministry of Defence. And as we all know, and that's been touched on again today, that defence innovation has well-known spillover benefits to other sectors, from communications to transport. Second, £11 billion would be ring-fenced from the National Wealth Fund, which would become the National Defence and Resilience Bank, and that funding is currently allocated to a number of non-vital eco-projects, while the remainder would stay focused on that national resilience point with things like water and transport. Thirdly, approximately £33 billion would be mobilised from private finance through the same model already used by the National Wealth Fund, unlocking billions more in investment. We all know that other countries are doing this. So countries such as the United States and Germany are already allocating huge funds for defence and bolstering their domestic manufacturing and technological base. We must do the same, because if we do not, we will become prey to those who do not value our way of life. So the government must act with urgency, match words with action, and help drive the cultural shift that will allow our country to be properly defended. That is why this debate matters so much, and I again thank my honourable friend from Windsor for bringing it forward, and I look forward to working with colleagues across this House to progress this agenda.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Ms McVeigh, and it's a pleasure to see you in the chair today. I would also just like to take a minute, if I may, to put on the record my deep sadness about the death of Captain Philip Gilbert Muldowney, who died on Sunday, and I know that my thoughts and thoughts of everyone here will be with his loved ones. I'm very grateful for the Honourable Member for Windsor for initiating this very important debate and for highlighting the unduly negative light in which, sadly, defence can sometimes be viewed within investment and academic circles. As I'm sure all honourable members here today do, and I consider myself also one of them, to care deeply about our society, our environment and good governance. But I welcome this opportunity here to set out why defence, rather than being incompatible with those values, really does underpin all three. Because I'm sure if you asked families in Ukraine whether greater spending on defence and deterrence over the last decade would have had a positive impact or a negative one on their society, environment and governance, you would get only one answer. I would just like to quickly just speak to some of the points raised in this debate. And I know that the Honourable Member for Windsor very rightly spoke about the importance of more money for SMEs within defence industry. And I know we have our target of spending £7.5 billion by 27-28 with SMEs, which is a 50% increase. Rightly note, and as I say, speak as somebody who used to work for an SME which had some interest in defence customers, how difficult a challenge it can be within that space without there being unfair negative attention paid to the industry that we were in. I also know the Honourable Member from Yeovil who spoke about the importance of support for Leonardo and helicopters, and I'll make sure those comments are passed over to the Minister for Defence Readiness and Industry. And I would note the Secretary of State did meet with Leonardo last week, and I know the Minister will continue dialogue with them and with the member himself. And I will also note the comments from the Honourable Member for West Dorset, and again, with these defence bonds, I'll again make sure that this comment is passed over to the Minister. I would like to thank the Honourable Member for York Outer for his excellent work in this issue and for rightly working with others across party and also with the Honourable Member for Aldershot in highlighting how important it is that we really understand how defence is absolutely underpinning environmental, social and governance issues rather than acting in opposition to those. He very rightly highlights in his own constituency the very positive impact that SMEs can have, particularly as he notes Needle and Pins Aerospace and Edmund Optics. I think it can be difficult for your average person to be able to understand exactly what we mean when we talk about defence SMEs, and he very rightly highlights the work they do in, for example, something as niche as helicopter insulation or indeed lens manufacturing or training support. He very rightly spoke about the issue with debanking, and again, as we talk about these issues, whether it is access to funds, access to banking, or any other financial services, how important it is that we understand exactly the issues that these SMEs may be facing. He also is very right to highlight the challenges that come particularly from long payment cycles for SMEs from primes. And again, as I worked in a small SME, I know how frustrating it can be when you have a product that you know the customer wants, that you can provide, but a long payment cycle and difficulty in being able to fund that is what is preventing what would be a good deal. The Honourable Member for Strangford, and I note his point about beyond the battlefield, and no doubt we'll speak to him after about it, very rightly notes the very proud history of Northern Ireland and Belfast in the defence industry, and I'm delighted for the LMM contract has further secured that industry, and I know that the future continues to be bright. And he is very right to highlight the huge importance that the defence industry gives to apprenticeships, having those highly skilled technical pipelines for young people to leave education, to start on a fantastic career, learning skills, earning a decent wage. It's hugely important, both in his constituency, my constituency, and I know many members' constituencies here, and he's very right to note them. Just turning quickly to the Honourable Member for North Durham, just quickly on some of the points that he raised. As he knows, when we talk about the impact on the planet, the MOD and our partners are absolutely committed, first and foremost, to safeguarding our national security. But we must recognise the impact of addressing climate-related risks. And of course, when we look at the intersection of climate-related risks and defence, we know that these are inextricably linked, as well as reducing environmental impacts. I know I'm not the only member in this House who has fond memories of doing their bit by picking up brass from trading areas, but of course, we must make sure that the MOD is doing its work across the board to make sure that we are understanding and considering our impact on the wider environment. He will know that our financial reporting is aligned with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Framework, which ensures that we are understanding climate risks both to the MOD and to our supply chain, because ultimately these are not acting in opposition, they are inextricably linked. Turning to his point on compliance policies, we are absolutely committed to mobilising private investors to take this fresh look at defence, as he said, which comes alongside the certainty of our own record long-term uplift in defence spending. This is particularly crucial for SMEs who are looking to scale up their concepts, ideas and prototypes. Whilst we recognise that, of course, with any bank to SME relationship, there will be commercial considerations and compliance processes, which will include ESG and no doubt other regulatory considerations, but nonetheless, we do welcome the Financial Conduct Authority's statement, which, as we have heard, confirmed that there are no rules within their regulations that prevent investment or finance for defence companies. And indeed, defence through the Office for Small Business Growth, which my colleague, the Minister for Defence Readiness and Industry, launched this week in Scotland, that with its further £2.5 billion spending target by 27-28, that as well as the Defence Innovation Unit, that this will mean that as well as proactively engaging the investor community to further build that market confidence, but also to collaborate on investment opportunities. Turning quickly to the points made by the Honourable Member for the Weald of Kent, I note absolutely her underlining of the importance of the defence for the nation. I would just say that I think it is not always helpful to conflate ESG and D&I, but nonetheless thank her for raising the previous government's record of failure on recruitment, highlighting their poor record on defence exports and indeed their failure to improve our sovereign energy capability. Just turning to the Honourable Gallup Member for Epsom and Ewell, and again, I thank her very strong statement that ESG and defence are not contradictory. As she rightly notes, that there are challenges for the defence industry and having stability is hugely, hugely important. She also raised the importance of continuously assessing threats, and I think she would also note my comments that we must therefore balance the long-term stability with, of course, assessing threats, and there would be a balance and trade-offs between the two. As she and other honourable members have mentioned about the Defence Investment Plan, I can assure her that we are working flat out to deliver it as soon as possible. And then turning to the Honourable Gallup Member for Exmouth and Exeter East, whose commitment to this topic is evident to see and is evidently very, very passionate. He very rightly notes the importance of allocations of capital and that we must act equitably here in this space and underline the importance that the defence industry plays both the security of this nation and indeed for the prosperity of our individual nations within the country as well. And he rightly notes the importance of defence industries, therefore, being able to go into academic spaces such as universities. And whilst, of course, we note the right for peaceful protest, nonetheless, they should be allowed to go into universities and show the huge opportunities within them that they can offer for those who seek careers in defence. He also rightly notes we shouldn't equivocate between dual-use military technologies and core defence capabilities. He's very right to say that weapons and ammunition are just as important as helicopter insulation, and we should not equivocate between the two. And I note his call for us not to do that. His wider suggestions, I will make sure, are passed to my colleague, the Minister, for full consideration. Reflecting this government's belief that investing in defence and the deterrent effect that it buys provides the stable foundation which everything else in this nation depends for our economy and our ability to go about our daily lives. And across this House, we must never stop reminding people that defence investment prevents wars for only a tiny fraction of the cost of fighting one. In our more dangerous and unpredictable world, as we implement the largest increase in defence spending since the Cold War and move towards a footing of warfighting readiness, we must therefore dismantle all barriers that might hold back defence investment. And that's why we have come into government determined to forge that much closer partnership between industry, innovators and investors, and to work together to find ways to unlock that investment. In terms of ESG, I think it's important that whilst we acknowledge the debate raging about the extent to which ESG considerations can be a brake on investment to defence, we should also, again, as I previously noted, the FCA's statement on how its own rules do not prohibit that financing investment in the defence sector. However, we have to note the anecdotal evidence about negative perceptions, a lack of understanding of the rules, are acting as a drag on defence investment by individuals and financial institutions. As part of our consultation on our defence industrial strategy, we did hear from smaller defence suppliers about their difficulties with access to finance, whether opening a bank account or securing a loan. And this is wrong. It harms British jobs, harms British firms, and it harms our national security. We've been loud and clear about the valuable economic and social contribution of the defence sector. Indeed, my colleague is frequently heard using the phrase engine for growth as he talks about the importance of defence investment. And I've already spoken about the work he did on Monday, launching the Office for Small Business Growth. This will work with small and medium-sized businesses to address the barriers that are hampering them at a time when we need them most. Through the Strategic Defence Review and the Defence Industrial Strategy, we've been clear about the societal value of defence investment, and we have been very clear, and I want to say this absolutely on the record, as clear as possible, we are very clear that defence is an ethical investment. We've illustrated how defence investment has repeatedly led to huge leaps forward in dual-use technologies, from advanced materials and computing to clean energy technologies as well. In our high-tech age of AI and quantum computing, these dual-use opportunities are magnified, as in turn is the potential for defence investment to stimulate jobs and economic growths. When we discuss ESG, I think we can all agree it's important that we do not completely dismiss ethical concerns. And you only have to look at Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities to understand that there can be a basis for legitimate concern about how weapons are used. But this government believes that the answer to these concerns in relation to UK-made equipment lies in robust export controls and international law, not in harming our own security by starving our defence industrial base of the investment it needs. So we've set in train an evidence-led approach to dismantling these barriers. We have a much closer partnership with the financial sector. We're working together to find new ways to unlock investment. And indeed, the Defence Secretary is convening a first-of-its-kind meeting with venture capitalists last April. We brought together venture capitalists, private equity, and other key financial services at our Defence Investment Summit in September. And that group of experts is also helping to inform our defence finance and investment strategy. This will reflect the work that we are doing with the FCA and the pensions regulator to explore the impact of all regulations on defence financing and investment. It will also set out steps that we can take to tackle the perception that some hold that defence is an unethical investment. Many of us have already previously spoken about the importance of the pipeline of skilled and talented innovators. So again, we must make sure that we are addressing negative perceptions of defence in the education centre. And to do this, we have committed to establishing the Defence Universities Alliance. This will bring together a network of universities, the MOD, armed forces and the wider sector to promote defence careers and support defence research. For too long, the defence sector has had an unearned and unfair reputation, which is likely to harm defence investment. This government is determined to change that narrative, and we're working hard to do so. Yes, war is brutal, but the best way of avoiding it is to invest in deterrence, which means investing in defence. In doing so, we fuel the virtuous circle of investment, jobs and growth that benefits communities right across the country by making ourselves more secure at home and stronger abroad. Something that I know everybody in this room can get behind.
Jack Rankin to wind up.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. I want to thank all honourable members from across this chamber for their considered contributions, particularly from York Outer, for Strangford, North Durham and the Weald of Kent. There has been some slight change of emphasis between different speakers, but we're all in support of a safe and confident Britain and understand that the first responsibility of His Majesty's Britannic government is defence of the realm. Investment in defence is patriotic and it is necessary, and it helps to make war less likely. I thank the Minister for her comments here today. Given the increasingly dangerous world which we live in, we should take that action today. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered the impact of environmental, social and government requirements on the defence industry. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 4 p.m. and a vote. Yeah, brilliant.